It was the summer of 1940. Europe burned under the shadow of war. Skies filled with smoke, and the fate of Britain hung by a thread. Every dawn brought the same dread. The drone of engines over the channel, the sharp whistle of diving bombers, and the defiant roar of Spitfires and Hurricanes climbing to meet them. But among the chaos of the Battle of Britain, one strange and unbelievable story stood out. A moment when a single pilot's desperate gamble turned the tide of an entire air battle. A maneuver so reckless, so unthinkable, that it caused 6 German Stukas to crash into their own base without a single British bullet being fired. This is a forgotten story of the blind dive, the split-second decision that turned a suicide mission into one of the most bizarre victories in RAF history. The legend begins over the English Channel, at a time when the Luftwaffe believed Britain was on its knees. The year was 1940. France had fallen. Norway, Denmark, the Low Countries, all had bowed to Hitler's blitzkrieg. Britain was the last free stronghold in Western Europe, and the Nazi war machine was determined to crush it next. Every day, waves of German bombers crossed the Channel, escorted by the feared Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. Their targets, radar stations, airfields, and cities. And among the Luftwaffe's most terrifying weapons were the Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, screaming metal angels of destruction whose sirens, called Jericho trumpets, could make entire towns panic before the bombs even fell. But the Stuka had one weakness. It was slow, clumsy, and vulnerable once enemy fighters got above it. The RAF learned that quickly. Yet, despite that knowledge, every encounter with the Stukas was a deadly gamble. They attacked in tight, precise formations, each dive perfectly timed and coordinated. To face them head-on required not only skill, but nerve. One of the men who had that nerve was Flight Lieutenant Richard Reynolds of the Royal Air Force, a name largely forgotten outside the dusty corners of war archives. Reynolds was not a famous ace. He didn't have dozens of kills to his name or medals pinned to his chest. But he had something rarer, instinct, a gut feeling that could read the sky like a map. And on one fateful day, that instinct would lead him to perform a maneuver that defied every rule of aerial combat. The story takes place near Calais in late August 1940, just days after the Luftwaffe began its full-scale assault on Britain's southern airfields. Reynolds and his squadron had been scrambled to intercept a formation of Stukas returning from a bombing raid over Dover. The weather was poor, visibility fading, clouds rolling thick and heavy across the channel. The British radar had picked up faint echoes heading back toward France. Normally, it would have been pointless to pursue, chasing bombers at far-risk fuel, weather in the wrath of the German fighters waiting across the coast. But something about that radar trace caught Reynolds' attention. He requested permission to follow, but radio interference broke the line. So he made the call himself. He went alone. The hurricane roared into the low-cloud base, the world vanishing into a gray blur. Reynolds had no visual, no horizon, no sunlight, just to hum the engine and the dull, ghostly glow of his cockpit instruments. To most pilots, flying blind was suicide. But to Reynolds, it was instinct. He knew the rhythm of his aircraft, the sound of his own heartbeat inside that metallic coffin. Somewhere ahead, through that soup of cloud and wind, were the Stukas, heading home after unleashing their bombs on British soil. He had one thought. If he couldn't see them, maybe they couldn't see him either. For nearly 20 minutes, he flew blind, adjusting altitude by touch, by gut, by faint readings on the compass. Then suddenly, the clouds broke, and there they were, 6 Ju-87s in tight formation, gliding back toward the French coast. Below them, faint in the haze, lay their own airfield, the Stuka base near Wissant. Reynolds had no radio contact with his command, no backup, and worst of all, no altitude advantage. He was directly above them, but only barely. The Stukas hadn't seen him yet. At that moment, most pilots would have broken away. He was outnumbered, low on fuel, and alone in enemy skies. But Reynolds wasn't thinking like a textbook fighter pilot. He was thinking like a hunter. He knew if he attacked from behind, he'd have seconds before their rear gunners filled the sky with lead. But if he dove straight down to the cloud, fast, silent, unseen, he might just scare them into chaos. And so began the blind dive. It wasn't a plan. It wasn't even a tactic. It was pure, unfiltered desperation. Reynolds pushed his Hurricane's nose forward and plunged into the fog, engine screaming, wings shuddering, speed building past the safety limit. He had no visibility, no idea how far the ground was, only a gut feeling that he was falling toward something, anything. Then, through the mist, came the sound, the Stuka sirens, not from above, but below, and that's where the impossible began. Through the thick gray veil of cloud, Reynolds' Hurricane sliced downward like a falling blade. The altimeter needle spun wildly. Air screamed past the cockpit. He gripped the stick with both hands, forcing his breath to steady. Then, the clouds tore open, and below him lay the 6 Stukas, spread like dark crosses against the pale sky. He had fallen directly into their formation. For a split second, none of the German pilots reacted. They didn't expect an attack here, this close to their base, this deep into their own territory. Reynolds' sudden dive made them think something impossible was happening. Perhaps a squadron of Hurricanes had followed them home through the storm. In that confusion, the Stuka formation broke apart in panic. Reynolds didn't fire, not a single bullet. His guns were loaded. His finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't need to. The Stukas below began to scatter, twisting and diving erratically, each pilot convinced the others were being targeted. In the chaos, their rigid formation discipline, the very precision that made them so deadly, became their undoing. The first Stuka rolled too sharply and clipped the wing of another. Both aircraft spiraled downward, smoke trailing from their engines. A third pulled into a desperate dive, tried to escape what he thought was a pursuing fighter. The clouds swallowed him whole. Seconds later, there was a flash on the ground, an explosion near the edge of the Wissant airfield. The German anti-aircraft crews below, already on high alert, saw shapes diving out of clouds and opened fire, thinking the British had launched a surprise raid. What followed was chaos on an industrial scale. The gunners couldn't tell friend from foe. Visibility was terrible, panic spread fast, and the Stuka pilots were flying blind, literally and psychologically. They dove to escape flak that was, in reality, coming from their own base. One by one, they crashed or collided trying to land under fire. In less than 3 minutes, 6 Stukas were lost, every one of them destroyed without Reynolds ever firing his guns. And when the smoke cleared, the base at Wissant looked as if it had been bombed by an entire British squadron. Reynolds, still above the wreckage, could hardly believe what he'd witnessed. He leveled his Hurricane, checked his instruments, and realized he had just enough fuel to make it back to the channel. Behind him, German sirens wailed, and black puffs of anti-aircraft fire marked the sky. He turned north, disappearing back into the clouds that had saved him moments earlier. When he finally landed back in England, his ground crew noticed the bullet holes in his wings, not from enemy aircraft, but from the German gunners on the ground who had fired wildly during confusion. His squadron leader initially refused to believe his story. 6 bombers destroyed, not by combat, but by their own side? It sounded absurd. But reconnaissance photos taken later confirmed the strange truth. 6 Stuka wrecks littered the Wissant airfield. No British bombs. No signs of external gunfire. Just chaos and craters. It became known among the pilots as Reynolds' blind dive, a madman's move that somehow worked. A moment of reckless genius that would never be repeated, because no one else would dare try it. What makes this story even stranger is how closely it reflected the fragile psychology of air combat at the time. The Luftwaffe trained its Stuka crews for precision. Every dive had to be measured, controlled, exact. But that precision relied on absolute confidence and communication. The second fear entered the equation. The Stuka became a death trap. British pilots learned that exploiting fear could be just as powerful as bullets. The sound of a diving engine, the glint of a wing through cloud, these tiny signals could unravel formation completely. In modern air warfare studies, historians often point to the Reynolds incident as a psychological turning point in the early days of the Battle of Britain. It showed how much chaos could come from confusion, and how the human element, more than technology or numbers, decided the outcome of the fight for the skies. Reynolds didn't have superior speed or firepower. He had something else: unpredictability. In a war built on precision, he weaponized uncertainty. But the story also hides deeper truths. For years, the RAF never officially documented the blind dive in detail. Some say it was because it sounded too unbelievable, too close to a myth. Others think it was covered up because command didn't want pilots attempting such dangerous solo pursuits again. Fly into cloud without instruments, beyond range, alone over enemy territory. It violated almost every operational rule. Yet, that's exactly what Reynolds did. And he came back alive. Decades later, fragments of his logbook surfaced in a private collection. The entry for that day was simple. No dramatic words. No boasts. Just 3 short lines. Intercepted 6 Ju-87s returning from Dover. Lost them in cloud. Returned to base, heavy weather. Nothing about the crash. Nothing about the chaos he'd caused. Maybe he didn't even realize the full scale of what had happened. Maybe he thought he'd failed the mission until the reconnaissance photos proved otherwise. In later years, pilots who served alongside Reynolds described him as quiet, methodical, almost shy. He wasn't the type to tell tall tales at the bar. And that's perhaps why his story survived not through reports, but through whispers, passed from one generation of RAF flyers to another. A legend born from one impossible moment in clouds. Today, historians debate how much of the blind dive can be verified. Some records match the timing and losses. Others suggest coincidence. But even if parts of it blur with myth, the essence remains. One man, one plane, and one act of defiance that turned the Luftwaffe's precision against itself. And as the skies over Britain filled with fire in those months of 1940, it was stories like this, whispered, half-believed, and deeply human, that gave hope to a nation standing alone. As Reynolds disappeared into the clouds, back toward England, the world below continued to burn with confusion. The Wissant airfield had become a scene of chaos unlike anything the Luftwaffe had ever experienced from the enemy. Engines smoking, twisted metal scattered across runways, flares still burning from anti-aircraft fire. It looked like a battlefield after a full-scale bombing raid. Yet the strange reality was that no bombs had fallen, no Spitfires had engaged, and no Hurricanes had fired a single shot. All of it had been the product of fear, instinct, and one man's impossible dive. Word eventually filtered through German command. Reports from Wissant were chaotic, almost nonsensical. Pilots claimed collisions, sudden dives, and evasive maneuvers that defied logic. Ground crews described explosions they couldn't explain. For days, commanders debated what had happened. Some blamed pilot error. Others suggested sabotage, but no one ever considered the possibility that a single British fighter, invisible, unheard, untouchable, had caused a disaster. To the Germans, it was a mystery wrapped in shame. Back in England, Reynolds' return was understated. He landed, shut down his Hurricane, and walked away from the cockpit, breathing heavily but smiling faintly. His squadron leader met him on the tarmac. "Where were you? What happened?" he demanded. Reynolds shrugged. "I got lost in the clouds. Then, I saw them." He left it at that. The men around him laughed, thinking he was joking. But the smile never left Reynolds' face. A smile that hinted at something only he understood. The secret knowledge of battle fought in silence and chaos. Over the following weeks, British intelligence pieced together fragments of the incident. Reconnaissance photos confirmed 6 Stukas destroyed at Wissant. Reports indicated minimal British involvement. When analysts tried to understand it, they concluded one improbable truth. The Stukas had essentially destroyed themselves. Reynolds' dive had created the perfect storm of panic, fear, and confusion. By exploiting human instincts under extreme pressure, he had weaponized chaos. And in doing so, he had rewritten the rules of engagement, at least for that singular, extraordinary moment. It was a lesson the RAF carried forward, the idea that psychological pressure could be as deadly as firepower. Pilots were trained to think not just about bullets or bombs, but about unpredictability, surprise, and leveraging the enemy's own weaknesses against them. Reynolds' dive became an unofficial case study, referenced in briefings and passed along in stories, but never officially credited in reports. War history, in all its focus on numbers, medals, and statistics, often overlooks moments like these, moments where human intuition trumps machinery, where courage meets chaos, and where a single act can ripple outward with consequences far beyond what anyone imagined. But what about the Stuka crews? The men who had fallen victim to the blind dive. Some survived crashes at the edge of the airfield, battered and shaken, their planes wrecked. Others were less fortunate. The psychological impact was enormous. Pilots who had been disciplined, trained, and confident suddenly realized how fragile their sense of control could be. That fear, that split-second panic, would haunt them for the rest of the war. And in many ways, it echoed the larger story of the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain, a force confident in its dominance, yet undone by unpredictability, resilience, and the stubborn ingenuity of the British defenders. Reynolds himself continued to serve, quietly performing missions over France and the Channel. He avoided fame, avoided the press, and avoided telling anyone the full story. To him, it wasn't about glory, it was about survival and duty. Yet in the halls of RAF stations, the legend grew. Pilots would whisper about the man who made Stukas crash without firing a shot, a tale told to inspire courage, caution, and audacity. It became one of those rare stories of World War II where cleverness, instinct, and nerve triumph over sheer force. Today, the Wissant airfield no longer exists as it did in 1940. Time has erased the scars of war, but the story survives in books, archives, and the imagination of those who study aerial warfare. Military historians still cite it as a perfect example of psychological disruption, how fear, confusion, and misperception can turn precision into disaster. And for those who understand it fully, Reynolds' dive wasn't just a lucky maneuver. It was a masterclass in daring and instinct, a moment when a single human being bent the rules of combat without even reaching for a trigger. Perhaps the most striking lesson to blind dive is that war isn't always about superior weapons or strategy. Sometimes it's about the human element, the ability to think fast, act decisively, and trust one's instincts when the world becomes chaos. In the clouds over northern France, one pilot did exactly that. And for a few extraordinary minutes, the unstoppable Stuka became its own worst enemy. As the sun set on that summer day, the skies returned to calm. British fighters patrolled cautiously, radar stations blinked in the twilight, and the Channel waters shimmered beneath the fading light. But somewhere in the minds of those who flew that day, the memory of Reynolds' dive lingered, a reminder that courage, cunning, and a single audacious decision could change the course of events, leaving a mark far beyond what any medal or citation could capture. It was a story of fear turned against itself, of chaos turned into victory, and of one RAF pilot whose daring instincts created an impossible triumph. And so, the blind dive entered legend, a moment where the sky itself seemed to bend to the will of a single man, and 6 Stukas became a lesson in hubris, fear, and the unexpected power of human daring. The story survives not just as history, but as a testament to the unpredictable, astonishing, and often bizarre nature of aerial warfare, where sometimes the greatest victories are won not with fire, but with sheer audacity.